All right. Hi, Founder fans. Welcome to Founder of the Day, where I am using, as Matthew puts it, my new fancy setup. Thank you so much for coming. This is a very exciting day for several reasons, and we will be getting to the last 7 founders from my website, Founder of the Day, real quick, but I do want to acknowledge that I am using all the new equipment and some new programming. All right. And there will probably be Founder some fans, welcome way, to yes, Founder of the Day, where I am using, as Matthew puts it, my new fancy setup. Thank you so much for coming. This is a very exciting day for several reasons, and we will be getting to the last 7 founders from my website, Founder of the Day, real quick, but I do want to acknowledge that I am using all the new equipment and some new programming. Right. And there will probably Founder fans, welcome to Founder of the Day, where I am using, as Matthew puts it, my new fancy setup. Thank you so much for coming. This is a very exciting day for several reasons, and we will be getting to the last 7 founders from my website, Founder of the Day, real quick, but I do want to acknowledge that I am using all the new equipment and some new programming. Right, and there will probably Founder fans, welcome to Founder of the Day, where I am using, as Matthew puts it, my new fancy setup. Thank you so much for coming. This is a very exciting day for several reasons, and we will be getting to the last 7 founders from my website, Founder of the Day, real quick, but I do want to acknowledge that I am using all the new equipment and some new programming. Right, and there will probably Founder fans, welcome to that. Is that better? That should be better. Did I fix it real quick? Let me know. I hope so. Sorry for that introduction. If it was terrible, I'll do it again. So anyway, assuming that I muted whatever the multiple is and not my great microphone, welcome to the first anniversary of Founder of the Day. It's been 1 year that I've been doing this. Not that I've been doing it live. Great. Thank you, Matthew, for letting me know. That would have been terrible. Not that I've been doing it live for a year. Clearly, I'm still feeling things out. But like I said, this is a new setup that my Patriots, including Matthew, were so gracious enough to help me pay down a little bit, because I'm trying to make this great for everyone. So, I should have gone back for that. Hi, I'm welcome back. Will it? Yeah, it will. This is really fun. I'm learning a ton. And not just about the American Revolution, but you guys want to hear about the Revolution, so let's talk about it. Let's go back over here. We're going to talk about William Barton. This gentleman over here, if I can do it, this gentleman is William Barton. William Barton was in Rhode Island when the American Revolution broke out. Now, I like to say often on this channel that it wasn't just the... I gotta get used to this. There's ways I can put the buttons and set it all up. Anyway, he wasn't just in the Continental Army. It wasn't just the Continental Army. Each individual colony had its own army. They called it a militia. It was a militia of regular people who joined to fight, but it was essentially an army. And so there were at least 13 or 14 armies fighting in the Revolutionary War. But on top of that, Rhode Island was interesting because even before the Revolution, Rhode Island had its own army. It was a super small army, but these men were full-time soldiers who were paid for it. And William Barton joined this army as the Revolutionary War broke out. So he was an officer in the army, but he's in Rhode Island, and Newport was very important as a saltwater port, because during this time, certain freshwater ports like New York City could freeze over, and that would cause a great deal of discomfort for the British, who had all their ships parked there. So Newport, Rhode Island, was an extremely important port, although people there, the generals there, were just kind of sitting around waiting for things to happen. So eventually they kept leaving. There was a lot of turnover in this position. And eventually a gentleman named Richard Prescott comes around. Richard Prescott was a major general in the British Army. He comes to watch over Newport. Now, the Navy was important at Newport, and they were at the port, and the army that Richard Prescott oversaw was north of that. And there was an island in between, and Richard Prescott commandeered a house in between the Army and the Navy. Now, this might sound a little risky, and it would be. We'll get to that. But I do want to note that he would later be court-martialed for all of this and found to be innocent of any wrongdoing, because having your house on an island between your Navy and your Army should be a secure location. However, he did not think about William Barton. William Barton put together a kidnapping. Yes, a kidnapping. They rowed across at night. They muffled their oars. They had no lights. They made certain not to bring any alcohol. And he got his men. He narrowed it down to the 40 best rowers that he could find. They went by night. And this is not with the Continental Army or Rhode Island. This is just what William Barton decided to do all by his lonesome. So they get in and they start rowing. And they row across and they sneak up to his house. Lights out. Super quiet. They do come across a sentry at the door. But he calls out and says, give me the sign, the passcode. What's the passcode? Or I forget the exact terminology he used. But essentially he asked for the passcode. And the guy said, yeah, I'm coming. I'll show you. And they got real close. Then had a gun in his face and said, if you make a move, we're going to kill you. They took him, they go inside, and they find the man whose house the British general took over, who seems to have been a loyalist anyway, and his son, and they shout, and Barton runs upstairs with his guys, and they get him, and he acknowledges he's been captured, not really kidnapped. I just kind of wrote that to make it sexy and intriguing, but he was captured, and then his number two tries to sneak out the window, and as soon as he got out, there was someone there waiting for him. Now, unfortunately for Prescott, this is the second time he was captured during the war, and it didn't look great for him. But as for our friend William Barton, he became a hero. He took the initiative to do this all by himself. And he went out and he captured a major general. It's a really big deal. Who would later be used in exchange for Major General Charles Lee, who was at that point still the number 2 or 3 general. I think the number 2 general in the Continental Army, like right after Washington. That's how important this capture was. So Barton gets injured a few years later and never fully recovers from his injury, but he does get a sword from the Continental Congress in thanks for his service. One of the few people who got a sword or some medal or award of that nature from the Continental Congress, from the Continental Congress, who never actually served in the Continental Army. Again, he was in a different body. Usually, if it were the militias or the Rhode Island Army, they would be given their thing on their own. But no, the Continental Congress recognized what a big deal this was. Barton had a really interesting life after this. So Rhode Island, he would go back to Rhode Island and invest in some land up in Connecticut. Rhode Island had they were very reluctant to join the Constitution, the United States under the Constitution. Didn't send anyone to the Constitutional Convention. Signed in almost 2 years, a year and a half after, like, Washington was already president for almost 2 years by the time that Rhode Island was like, fine. Like, it's just us by ourselves. Clearly we have no choice. My friend Tom likes to call it a coup because, Rhode Island didn't exactly assent to the Constitution. But either way, when they finally did ratify the Constitution, the person they sent on horseback to New York City to talk to already President Washington was William Barton. Had the honor of telling Washington and the United States Congress already assembled that Rhode Island reluctantly will be joining the Union. After this, and I've written about him before, I just like to tell the whole story because Barton's a really interesting character. Even though this article was specifically about the capture, Barton ends up, as I said, investing heavily in land in Vermont, and he ends up moving there. And the town becomes known, it's named after him, Barton. I think it's just called Barton, but it might be like Bartonville or Bartonton, but it's got literally his last name in it. And he goes and he starts selling some of the property he owns, and he sells a little more than he actually owns, which becomes a problem when he gets sued by 2 people show up on the same land and say, no, Barton sold me this, no, Barton sold me this. He gets in a little bit of trouble for this. In fact, he's put on this weird type of house arrest because he can't afford to pay his fine, where he's not allowed to go more than a mile outside of the village proper. So he's a prisoner in a town named after himself. And he's actually doesn't want to sell land or can't really afford the payments. And from the age of 64, this is years later, but from the age of 64 until 77, 13 years, He stays as a prisoner in this town until, what do you know, the Marquis de Lafayette's doing his reunion tour through all the states, and he comes through Virginia and remembers Barton for being a hero of the war. And the Lafayette, the hero that he always is, pays off Barton's debt, eventually freeing him to return to Rhode Island, where he finally passes away as a very old man. That is the life of William Barton. Now, I don't see any... I'm still getting this new system down. I don't see any questions. Feel free to ask questions. I can see the people... Well, okay. I'm starting to get the hang of it. I apologize. I am getting in this setup. It's going to be great in a few weeks. Keep coming back. But let's go over to our Anti-Federalist Fridays, which used to be Federalist Fridays, as I say every week, and is now Anti-Federalist Fridays. And we're going to talk about a gentleman named Benjamin Workman. Where do I get all these details? I will return to that question in just a moment. You know what? We're between things. Great time for a question. Mr. Divorced Dad, where do I get all the fascinating, in-depth details? From many places. I really enjoy reading this. For some of the more obscure founders, it's relatively easy to find these details because there's not a whole lot of information out there about them. So you find one thing and you're good to go. I will give credit to my favorite thing to listen to, the AmRev podcast. When I wrote this article, I think last weekend, and I was reminded of Barton's story listening to an episode of that great podcast. Not that I'm trying to take anything from it. Go listen for yourself. It's the American Revolution podcast. Michael Troy over there does an amazing job. And sometimes I just like listening to it because it keeps me familiar with the whole story. And I was driving to the store and back listening to it, and he goes into a lot more depth on Barton's story, and what's his name? Drawing a blank. Prescott. Richard Prescott's story. He goes a lot more into Richard Prescott's story. So definitely check that out. Especially if you want a lot more detail. It's in the Saratoga campaign. I think he came out with it in last March. It was one of the episodes last March. Just after Hubbardton. So for that particular story, I was very much influenced by that particular episode. But for most of these, I just really enjoy finding it. So I like the digging. So thank you for asking so much. I will continue. So I'm not just answering your question, but I will be happy to answer more. We're going to talk about Benjamin Workman. Oh, I forgot. I've got this up behind me now. That's very interesting. This is my standard, if I don't have a photograph for someone, Anti-Federalist photograph. So it's not a big deal. Benjamin Workman is a super obscure person who it is really, 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 really hard to find any information about. So I found what I could. And he seems to have been an Irishman who somewhere in Europe received an extraordinary education in mathematics. And so much so that he was convinced by the College of Philadelphia, what we now know today as the University of Pennsylvania, convinced him to leave his home, cross an ocean, and come to the United States and be a mathematics professor in Philadelphia. He did this, and he seems to have done a pretty good job at the mathematics, though I couldn't find much either way. I assume he did fine, because he kept his job for a while, despite being publicly kind of a nuisance. Because, you know, as far as Anti-Federalists go, they didn't like the Constitution, and they spoke out about it. Now, Workman published in the Independent Gazetteer, which is one of my favorite words in the world, Gazetteer. He published under the pseudonym Philadelphiensis, I assume is how you pronounce it. Here, I'll get it nice and big for you. Right here. Philadelphiensis was his pseudonym, publishing in Philadelphia, making it nice and confusing. But Workman really hated the Constitution, even though he'd only been in the country a few years. Now, what's interesting about his particular attacks is most Anti-Federalists, especially the ones we've talked about so far, were specific about their attacks. They, at least on the facade, had some kind of thought in regards to political philosophy and why theoretically the Constitution was bad. Not Workman. Workman just talked trash. I want to use the cuss word because that's how serious it is when you read through some of it. He's like, no, they're these filthy aristocrats who just come and take our money. It's just more slavery. They threw off the king so they could be kings themselves. Like really harsh, sensationalized attacks on the Constitution and specifically the people who wrote it, which is really tough. But what's fascinating about this is, I've already got it down here, Hopkinson's rebuttal. So Francis Hopkinson was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was an artist before artists were a thing. He wrote poetry and songs. He was one of the creators of the design of the American flag and the Great Seal of the United States because he was a Continental Congressman for so many years. He, I believe, was from Maryland, but he spent most of his life in Philadelphia in social circles that were, weekend. In France, they called them saloons or salons. In America, I don't even know what they called them, coffee houses. They would meet up weeknights or weekends and have parties and talk philosophy and paint and be deep. And he was that fancy pants artist of the revolution. And Francis Hopkinson, he wrote a response, which is almost in a way more important than the actual thing itself, than the actual writings of Philadelphiensis. Because he wrote a paper called The New Roof. And his basic premise was the Articles of Confederation is a house that was just built like 10, 15 years ago. Except you had someone come look at it now, and even though it's only 10, 15 years old, it's going to fall down. The whole thing is terrible. And he uses that an analogy, or allegory? I guess I'll call it. I'm not a literary student, so I think allegory is the right way to phrase it. He uses this allegory to demonstrate that it's not that the house was bad. It's just all the parts of the house were not great. I hope I'm explaining this right. Like, yeah, the house is standing, but it can fall down at any time. And the wood is fair, but it's getting eaten alive by bugs and this and that, and eventually culminates with the roof. Something along the lines of the roof has been like stomped upon by people. It's very strange. It's hard to relate. But basically, the way he broke it down is this whole the Constitution is replacing the old house. The reason it's confusing and hard for me to get out is because Hopkinson's, it's not great for an artist. He's trying to be political. He was a politician, but essentially he's saying the Articles of Confederation are old house, and the Constitution is new materials to fix this old house. Except you're going to replace the old house, and it's just a new roof, but again, it's not the best paper. But what it did is for the average person walking around the streets who couldn't read even the not so intellectual writings of Philadelphiensis, they read Hopkinson's rebuttal. They read The New Roof and understood the Constitution to be solving the problem. Plain and simple. Just like you might see on television today. Here's how it solves a problem. Oh, okay. I'm not going to look any deeper. I'll just take the TV at its face value. Believe it or not, most regular people didn't have the time to study the Constitution and politics. That's one of the arguments made in the Federalists, that the Senate should be appointed by the states and not elected, because only statesmen would have the opportunity to really study how politics should and does and do work. And there's a nugget of truth to that, and the people of Philadelphia demonstrate this when they read Hopkinson's rebuttal and just kind of went with it. So it's Hopkinson's rebuttal. Please let me know if you have any questions. I am going to, it is easy to find another Divorced Dad American Revolution podcast. They have a blog. Whatever you listen to music on, it's on there. Check it out. I can't recommend it enough. It's the only thing better than Founder of the Day. But let's carry on. Let's go talk about this gentleman. It's a little bit blurry on my screen. Unfortunately, when I load them up to my website, it blows them up really big, and most images I can access from olden times can't really handle it, but that's okay. This guy's name is Robert Hanson Harrison. Robert Hanson Harrison is possibly the most important military figure that you've never heard of. At least the most important member of Washington's Family, of which we're about to talk about too. Because every weekend, I reuse some old articles. Sorry, I'm only writing new ones 5 days a week. So, Robert Hanson Harrison is the first of the two that I reused over the weekend, and the first of the two who were part of General Washington's family. Robert Hanson Harrison, I always want to switch his middle and last name. As I say in here, if you've listened to the play Hamilton, you hear the song Right Hand Man about how Alexander Hamilton was George Washington's right hand man. And while there is a hunk of truth to that during Washington's presidency, during the Revolutionary War, the truth is Robert Hanson Harrison was Washington's right hand man. Harrison was already a little bit of a lawyer for a little while before the war broke out, and he was extremely intelligent, and he started acting as George Washington's military secretary. Now, many members of the family did secretarial duties, but as military secretary, Harrison was in charge of getting documentation to where it had to go. I'm going to blow myself back up. I'm still figuring this out. So, when Washington said, okay, here's the general orders, Harrison would write it down and then either make copies himself or have other people make copies and send it around the continent wherever there were other armies of the Revolutionary Army. And then those major generals would get the orders and then pass them down, or at least those major generals, military secretaries, would get Harrison's notes and pass them down. Furthermore, Harrison was in charge of sending out personal correspondence. Although, as I said, people like Hamilton and Lafayette, not so much Lafayette, but Laurens, several other of the younger members of the Washington's family who were aides de camp, were their technical terms. But Washington generally, we know them as Washington's family. A lot of them did write notes for the general and write correspondence on his behalf. Famously, as I said, Hamilton. But usually it was in Robert Hanson Harris's hand. Ooh, say that 5 times. I can't even say it once. Robert Hanson Harrison's hand. Now, what's super interesting about Robert Hanson Harrison, and I'm going to bring him back up next to me because he deserves another look. What's super interesting about Robert Hanson Harrison is after the war, he goes back and he works as a lawyer, and he actually works on several things for George Washington's personal legal doings, because it's not like he was in legal trouble, but Washington was always doing business publicly and making agreements and deals. Robert Hanson Harrison actually gets appointed as Chief Justice of the Maryland Supreme Court. And I do want to say, let me go back. I named this article Robert Hanson Harrison, Revolutionary Chief of Staff, because from my perspective, Robert Hanson Harrison was arguably the equivalent of a modern-day president's chief of staff. He was in charge of organizing everything. Granted, there were administrative positions that had a lot to do with this, the adjutant generals and things of that nature, quartermaster generals, but Robert Hanson Harrison was getting the information to the people. And then, after becoming Chief Justice of Maryland Supreme Court, well, what do you know? George Washington becomes president. Okay? And there's an election, and at the time it was different than today, where now you vote for president and vice president on a ticket. Back then, I will remind you that each elector casts 2 votes. And 2 votes for president. You have to vote for 2 people for president. Whoever got the most votes was president. Whoever got the second most was VP. Now George Washington, got 1 vote from each elector, getting unanimously elected with a lot of haggling from certain people. Notably, his next right-hand man, Hamilton. But John Adams overwhelmingly got the second most votes and became vice president. The person who was not a little bit below, but not that far below John Adams, was John Jay, who would get the consolation prize of, first Chief Justice of the United States of America. The person who got 4th most votes, by which I mean the person who got the 3rd most votes to be the first vice president of the United States of America, was Robert Hanson Harrison. I'm assuming this is not just because of his legal knowledge, but his time as the number 2 to George Washington throughout the Revolutionary War certainly didn't hurt. That's Robert Hanson Harrison. Hope you enjoyed. If you have any more questions, please let me know. I'm going to continue on after one quick sip of water because the suspense, the suspense. I'm going to move on to Caleb Gibbs. Now, there is no picture of Caleb Gibbs in the world. What you see behind me right here, I'll scroll down a little bit, is that is the flag of Washington's Lifeguards. Washington's Lifeguards? What, like he was swimming? No. It was the first Secret Service. At least it acts like the Secret Service does today, in that it was literally supposed to guard Washington's life. You see, this war breaks out. You might have heard of it, the Revolutionary War. And George Washington goes up to Boston and takes control of the Army of Observation, changes its name to the Continental Army. Again, probably heard all this. There's a young man there who had signed up right away, a 28-year-old major named Caleb Gibbs. And he had proved himself showing up the first day at the Battle of Lexington Concord, at the Battle of Bunker Hill. He was already helping with the siege. And Washington had very particular demands. But before I say that, Washington understood how important his life was to the Revolutionary War symbolically. He knew that no matter who the commander-in-chief was, I'm going to pop myself back open. I'm getting used to this. I will get used to it. Washington knew that no matter who the commander-in-chief was, if he were to be assassinated, it would destroy the morale of the army. And he knew it was him. So he knew he had to be protected. So he organized these lifeguards. Now, their official name was, I'm drawing a bit of a blank, Washington's Men. Oh, there was a name for it. Oh, look at me. Forgetting things. Washington's... man, it's really under my skin. I'm sure it'll turn up. Either way, we know them as Washington's Lifeguards. And at the time, the soldiers of the American Revolution knew them as Washington Lifeguards, too. That's just... They got familiar with that name. That's how they ended up. Okay, I'm sorry. Let me fix that. I'm figuring it out. Caleb Gibbs was this young man who had proven himself in battle. And I have a list here of several things that Washington was looking for in someone who was the head of the lifeguards, who was going to not only protect Washington's life, but scout out his camp location ahead of time and keep guard duty during of his headquarters while he's in there. They were in charge of moving his luggage and equipment, and the luggage and equipment of the Continental Army, including the money being sent by the Continental Congress to George Washington, was under the control of Christopher Gibbs, again, who was just a young Massachusetts boy of just 28 years old, who had made his way up. Now, what Washington was looking for before they found Gibbs was someone who was of a certain height, because they had to be at least close to Washington's height for that intimidation purposes. Quote, sobriety, honesty, and good behavior were important to Washington. And most important, quote, there is nothing more desirable than cleanliness in a soldier. He wanted them to have pressed uniforms. He wanted them to look good. And he wanted them to have well-maintained hygiene. Because, first of all, in a way for Washington, it seems that he would trust someone who was concerned about themselves and the way they presented themselves to the world. That was important to him, and it was important to people he was associating with. But additionally, he knew the prestige of the position, and he wanted to keep the office of Commander-in-Chief of the Army looking as prestigious as possible. And the manner by which Caleb Gibbs carried himself indicated he was right for the position. Now, eventually they shrunk the size of the lifeguards, and it seemed like a demotion, so Caleb Gibbs left the position. It's hard to tell if he was relieved from the position or if he resigned the position, but he did leave to go continue fighting in the Continental Army. In fact, he would continue through Yorktown and be wounded at the Battle of Yorktown. There are not all that many men who fought from Lexington and Concord through Yorktown. That's, 6.5 years there, and that's a good amount of your life, from 28 until plus 6.5. Is that like 34, 35? That's a huge chunk of a person's life. Anyway, Gibbs would go on. He would spend a lot of time in the harbor of Charleston in Massachusetts, and eventually was appointed by Washington as to run the naval yard there, and he oversaw the construction of ships, including the USS Constitution, which is a famous ship. If you guys have any other questions, we're going to keep on chugging. And we are going to go to Lydia Darragh. Now, this seems to be an engraving made about her telling some information to a soldier a while ago. So what's interesting about Lydia Darragh is she was an nobody. Unfortunately, like most women during the American Revolution, her story is mostly legend more than anything else because there's only so much we can verify as truth. Now, we do know that a woman gave Elias Boudinot a certain amount of information. But, as we will see, it's probably her. Either way. So Lydia Darragh, as the story goes, and also, she definitely had a... Let me tell the story. Lydia Darragh was living in Philadelphia, and the Patriots were there, and then they fled because the British were coming. And the British came and took over Philadelphia. And what happened is General Howe took over the house across the street, which used to belong to John Cadwalader. Eventually, shortly thereafter, several people were... a group of men run by Major John Andre, who would later be famous for conspiring with Benedict Arnold and getting hung. Major John Andre and several other high-ranking officers went into Lydia Darragh's house, Darragh's house, and said, "We need your house. Get out." And Lydia and her husband said, "No, we have nowhere to go." And they were like, "Fine, but you have to go to bed while we're in here doing our meetings, and then you can come out after we're done. We'll wake you up." Okay. So Lydia doesn't love this. Now, they were Quakers, if I'm not mistaken, and because they weren't really supposed to fight in a war, which is why they were trusted, even though they did have some relatives, including a son, who went out to fight in the war, giving up their Quakerism, which is or Quaker beliefs. I'm sorry I called it Quakerism. That might be offensive. I'm not sure. But their Quaker beliefs of nonviolence to go fight. But Lydia still claimed to be a Quaker, so the British seemingly didn't mind, which was a mistake because she went to bed and didn't go to sleep and listened to their meeting, and they said, "Okay, we're going to go surprise attack George Washington at White Marsh, which is in it's in Pennsylvania, north of Philadelphia." So Lydia goes across and wants to ask General Howe if she can go out of the city, because the city was on lockdown now that the British showed up and there's patriots about. Lydia goes on to say, "Hey, I want to go out to buy some flax." I forget exactly what she was getting. "I want to leave town for to go to the mill and buy some milled product." Now, on her way in, she ran into a guard. Now, she actually talks to her guard. I believe I can't recall exactly what her maiden name was. I believe it was Barrington or something of that nature. But she meets this guard who's guarding Howe's house. And she says, "I'd like to talk to him." He's like, "I don't know if you could do that." And then get into a conversation. "Oh, you're from Ireland? I'm from Ireland too originally." "Oh, what's your last name?" "Oh, that's my maiden name." "Wait, where are you from?" "Oh, wait, we're cousins." By total chance, as the story goes, the guard out front was her cousin. And because of that, he brought her in to talk to Howe, and Howe gave her permission to leave the city and go get some stuff from the mill. And she did. And on her way, she stopped and talked to an American officer. And this is the part, everything up until this point has pretty much been confirmed. The cousin thing is a little iffy, but other than that, everything's been confirmed, except who she talks to next. But she talks to someone in the Continental Army and says, "Hey, the British are going to attack you in a day and a half." And they go, "Really?" "Yeah." And she leaves. She gets her stuff from the mill, goes back home, no big deal. And the word gets back to General Washington, so when the British show up at White Marsh, well, the Americans are standing there with their guns ready to go. And the British actually say, "Whoa, we're not ready for this. We're supposed to be surprise attacking you, man. And that's not how it went down. So the British turn tail and go back home to Philadelphia. They do end up confronting, as the story goes. Again, this part also is hard to... Oh, no. This part is confirmed because Major John Andre has it in his notes. He actually confronts Lydia Durag, and asks her if she was involved, and she plays dumb and somehow gets away with it because he realizes, oh, maybe they just weren't asleep next room over. Maybe that's it. So, now, just to retract a little bit, the story is often told that she ran into a friend of her son who was an officer, Thomas Craig. That might be true, but we have information from Elias Boudinot, who was a future president of the Continental Congress, and at the time acting as assisting Washington with intelligence, by chance, and working as the commissary of prisoners. He was in charge of getting American prisoners in British custody supplies they needed to not live in the absolute squalor that they were living in. To a certain amount of success. Not a whole lot of success. There just wasn't all that much he could do. But as Elias Boudinot puts it in his journal, and we believe, historians believe, that this is how it went down because of how it was written in his journal, that a poor-looking, insignificant, quote, poor-looking, insignificant old woman comes into the Rising Sun Tavern just north of Philadelphia and hands him a bag. And the satchel, she leaves and then comes back a few minutes later, but gives him time to look through it, and it's completely empty except one rolled up note that's outlining the British movement and numbers. And as I said, it indicates that this old woman was probably Lydia Durag. And it was a success. And it's amazing. And that's the story of Lydia Durag, who I couldn't come up with a great title. I'll bring it back up. Lydia Durag steals away with information. Oh, that's right. I'm in the way. I'm learning. We do have some comments. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the founders were true badasses. Most of them were. I am fascinated. We could talk a lot about dying for your freedom today, but these were people who literally were cool with dying for their freedom. Yes, they held people in bondage, many of them. Sure. But there's no justification for that. There's no justification for that. But they were willing to die for what they believe were their freedoms. It's crazy to me. And I think a lot of Americans, if you really think about it, it's like, would I really? Take a lot. More than high taxes, probably. I know there was more than just the taxes. I make these videos all the time for a reason. Ambushing an ambush. Yeah, ADD, you're right. Pretty intense. Let's move on to this gentleman who's a little bit blurry on my screen. Again, that happens when I blow him up. His name is William Branch Gillies. That name is pronounced Gillies. I will be saying Giles the whole time because that's how I've always read it. I only found out it was Gillies as I was writing this article and doing the research for it. It's Giles, man. Look at it. It's clearly Giles. Freedom is worth dying for. I agree. It's just, when push comes to shove. It's pretty intense how many of them felt that way. William Branch Giles. He was one of the first people... William Branch Giles was elected to the United States House of Representatives for Virginia. He came from a wealthy Virginia family, had graduated from Princeton, had studied under George Wythe, who educated dozens, if not hundreds of American founders. Maybe not hundreds. College of William and Mary wasn't pumping out that many people, but most of the important people. But when he shows up as a young man, and he starts associating with James Madison, who was only elected to the House of Representatives when things went down. He tried to become a senator, but certain people who ran Virginia were so upset that he, did this whole making the Constitution thing that they didn't let him become a senator. And then ran James Monroe against James Madison for that House seat. They would later be friends. They were friends the whole time. They would ride together, hanging out in the carriage on the way to their election. But that's a digression. What happened was he essentially starts becoming one of the author of the book about Albert Gallatin that's downstairs that I've been reading, which is a great book. Not my book of the week. I will get to that. The author of that book says George May called Gillies a henchman. Now that's a little harsh. I would say he's a teammate, but Madison just is the captain of the team, and Gillies is on the team. But either way, a notable event happens earlier in his career when Hamilton is out there. He puts through his Treasury stuff, but Madison doesn't like him. Jefferson doesn't like him. They're really trying to stop what's going on. So, excuse me, I'm going to bring myself back up. Gillies actually puts through a censure of Hamilton. He tries to censure Hamilton on several counts because certain finances that were loaned from the Dutch that were supposed to be used to pay off the French seem to have gone into the wrong account for some reason. Now, the finances of Alexander Hamilton's early Treasury plan is extraordinarily complicated. I still have a ton of trouble with many of the details of it. As did Gillies, because he brings this to the table just as people are leaving for this session. It's like the last thing he does is say, hey, I'm going to censure Hamilton. People have already left. Should be easy, super sneaky and shady, but easy enough to do. And he tries to do it. But what happens? Well, Alexander Hamilton shows up with his papers and says, no, look, not only did I get the money to the right place, but in the process, I saved the country money. And, Gillies is like, derp. And Hamilton gets away with it again. And the reason this is in the Gallatin book is Gallatin would later be Jefferson's treasurer, and what's important about Gallatin is he actually understood what Hamilton was talking about, when most other founders didn't, and which why people like me have and most average students, even advanced students of the American Revolution, have trouble understanding many parts of Hamilton's treasury, the details of the Treasury plan, because not only was he creating the Treasury Department, but at the same time he's assisting in the creation of the Bank of New York, and the first Bank of the United States, and the New York Stock Exchange. Again, one of the reasons many Democratic Republicans were very scared of what Hamilton was doing is he was consolidating into a federal government, bringing in all the debts, bringing in all the money, creating national banks, creating a national debt, creating a stock market. Just tough to tough to deal with. For many people at the time, it was very tough to swallow, but it was so complicated they had trouble fighting it. And that's what happened to Gillies. He's a little bit embarrassed, but he comes back, he makes it back. Yeah, Jay Burmis, thanks for stopping by. Shout out to Jay Burmis, who's coming through here. Just a quick timeout. I do see my buddy Jay Burmis stopped by. He has his own channel that is great. Sorry to do this, Jay. It is a conspiracy channel. You know that's the easiest way to define it, although he is so much more. He's a longtime friend for me. We don't agree on all our politics, but Jay has done a humongous service in helping me figure out how to do things like this. And how to get the color on my camera right. We didn't talk about sound. I figured that out today myself. Hopefully it sounds good. I'll listen back later, make any adjustments for the future. So thanks to Jay Burmis. If you're interested in alternative theories on what's going on with the United States government, check out Jay Burmis. He is a wonderful personal friend of mine and a great YouTube mentor, if I might call him that. And that is the most compliments he will get out of me, because usually we insult each other to each other's faces. Anyway, back to our friend William Branch Giles. So Giles ends up, after these problems with Hamilton, he stays around supporting the Democratic Republican Party well into the American Revolution, well into the Thomas Jefferson presidency. Unfortunately, he starts to drift away. As I mentioned, Albert Gallatin, who would be Jefferson's Secretary of Treasury, and then James Madison's Secretary of Treasury, and really built the way we view the United States Treasury now is a lot on Albert Gallatin. Again, that's why I'm reading the book. I should have probably, in hindsight, made that the book of the week. But Gallatin understands Hamilton's thing, and that's why when Jefferson comes around and tries to get rid of Hamilton's Treasury platform, welp, no. Gallatin comes in and says, you can't just get rid of it, we'll collapse. And people like Giles and many other prominent Democratic Republicans really did not like what Gallatin was doing and what the Jeffersonian administration was doing during his presidency and Madison's presidency. And then after the war comes, what do you mean we're going to war? The War of 1812 I'm referring to. So he drifts away from the party and actually starts criticizing it pretty heavily. But interestingly enough, and he does during this time serve as a U.S. Senator during the Jefferson and Madison administrations. So he's there the whole time. He moves from the House of Representatives up to the Senate. He's on the federal scene. And he's like, what are you guys doing? Eventually, he goes back to Virginia and he publishes some anti-John Quincy Adams articles. And then he actually goes in and becomes governor of Virginia, despite all the trouble he's kind of been giving to his old buddies. Though at this point, by the time he's governor, it's a year or two after Jefferson dies. Madison is, approaching 80-something, so he's a few years before his death. And Giles himself holds the position for 3 years, the maximum 3 years, and then does die later that year, but as a much older person. So that's William Branch. Giles, I'm sure I called him Giles a bunch of times. Sorry about that. He died going on 200 years ago, so I assume he'll forgive me. But he's not that mad. Again, that's William Branch Giles. I'm going to pull you up here for a really great looking person. I don't usually like to judge people on their looks. It's not who I am. It's what's on the inside that counts. But I did notice right away that of all the old-timey pictures I've put up on this website in the last 2.5 years, well, William Lynn is not the most beautiful person I've ever seen. They could have dialed him up a little better. William Lynn, as you're seeing now, was the first chaplain of the United States House of Representatives. Now, William Lynn was from Pennsylvania, and he worked hard to become he studied theology. He became a preacher early in his life, just as the American Revolution was breaking out. And he actually joined as a preacher, as the chaplain. Sorry, I couldn't get the word out. The chaplain of a regiment for the Continental Army. At the time, most of the Continental Army had a surgeon, who was a doctor, and a chaplain, who was a preacher of some denomination. Doesn't much matter what. I mean, it did matter what, but not much. Yeah, because they would just go pray for everyone. Everyone would pray together. At war, I mean, it matters. Don't let me offend anyone's religion. That's not what I mean. That was a offhanded comment. I just meant, when you're at war, you don't have a lot of options. Eventually, he bounces around. He ends up as pastor at the Collegiate Dutch Reformed Church of New York City. It is very realistic, ADD. I agree. So he ends up at the Collegiate Dutch Reformed Church of New York City, and I can't memorize that. It's a very lengthy title. And he starts giving sermons there, becomes a little bit renowned. Now, remember, when the Constitution was ratified, the first several years of the United States of America, the capital was New York City. And they went there, and there was Mr. Lynn. And what happens? They need a chaplain. He signs up for the position, and he gets the job. And he spends the first 2.5 years of the existence of the United States. He is the religious authority in the House of Representatives. I do believe, and I want to look this up because I want to read an article about that person. I do believe the Senate had their own. He wasn't the chaplain of Congress. He was the chaplain of the United States House of Representatives. Though technically the House of Representatives is Congress, Senate is not Congress, but nowadays when we say Congress, we usually mean both. Whew, okay, that was a mouthful. Anyway, he spent 2.5 years as the religious authority Now, uh, he ended up also becoming college president of Queens College. What we know today is Rutgers University. He was president for about 3.5 years. Granted, as soon after he left, they had to close their doors for about a year because there were some financial difficulties, which I understand. He gets most of the blame for, but he still stayed on as the chaplain. I'm sorry, as a trustee or a regent of the University of New York. What is it called? University of the State of New York, which oversaw colleges for the state, which started a surprisingly long time ago. What he really became known for was speeches, particularly a sermon on the 4th of July of 1791, I believe it was, that he gave to the Tammany Society. And you might recognize the name Tammany Hall. And I'm not going to get too into this today, but Tammany Hall was more popular later on because the political machine. It essentially ran New York throughout all of the 1800s. It was actually started in the 1790s by a few people, including Aaron Burr. But it was not quite as corrupt, although we like to associate the name Burr with bad things. It was not quite as corrupt in the 1970s, in the 1790s, as it was later on. Additionally, he was chosen to give a sermon upon the death of George Washington. Now, many people gave many sermons across the United States upon the death of George Washington. There were eulogies, I shouldn't say sermons, eulogies. There were many eulogies all across the nation. What's interesting about this one is he gave it to the New York Society of the Sons of the Cincinnati. And as you probably know, the Sons of the Cincinnati were former officers in the Continental Army and still are the descendants of former officers of the Continental Army. So many of these men that were witnessing Lynn's sermon were officers who had served under Washington. I'm not sure who was there, but, people like Alexander Hamilton was a son of the Cincinnati who served under Washington. In 1804, Hamilton was still alive. Although I am not, I shouldn't say that. I'm not 100% certain that he was actually at that event necessarily, but just to give you some idea of the characters. So those are our 7 founders of the week. I do want to give a shout out, and I see there are some questions, and I will get to them. Plain Honest Men is the book of the week. I know I kept saying about the Albert Gallatin one. It's Jefferson's Treasure, it's called. That's a great book too. But there's a link to this down below. And the reason this is the book is tomorrow is Constitution Day. Had to look at the clock to figure out what day it was. Had to look. What day is today? Okay, what day is tomorrow? Oh, September 17th. It's Constitution Day. It's the day the Constitution was signed by most of the people who attended the Constitutional Convention, though certainly not all of them, foreshadowing next week's, the first person we'll talk about next week, and tomorrow's article. This is called Plain Honest Men. This is one of my favorite American Revolution books. The author takes you through the American Revolution, the Constitutional Convention, but it's not even that. It's the summer of 1787, and it's what the men were doing there. And it takes you through the notes and what they were doing at the Constitutional Convention, but it also talks about what they're doing, like what lady did Washington dine with that weekend? George Washington when he was off. And what days did they take off? What did they do on 4th of July when they took off to celebrate independence? This, Plain Honest Men is an amazing work. Unfortunately, the author, Richard Beeman, passed away about 10 years ago. But fortunately, he left this as his legacy. It's an unbelievable book. I have a link in the description down below. It won't cost you any extra money. Let's see what the questions are. Another great portrait is very eerily reported. Was he the chaplain that later became a Tory, Matthew? No, I think I have a link actually in the bottom to it of Jacob Duché. Yeah. Possibly even probably confusing him with Jacob Duché, who was the only chaplain of the First Continental Congress, which would have been about 15 years earlier. And Jacob Duché, who was an early patriot, did end up trying to convince Washington to surrender to the British Army in a letter, and that did not go over very well. I believe I am thinking about chaplain of the First Continental Congress, Matthew. There were several chaplains over the course of the Second Continental Congress. Zizbiz. No, I'm not actually a history professor. I am not even a teacher. I had thought as a younger person that I would be a history professor. I am a grad school dropout. Was going to grad school for a little bit and then, decided to start working full time. Thought I'd get back to it later. Decade had gone by, and instead of going back to it, I just started doing this. I've been reading about it the whole time. So no, I am not a professor. I do not have a PhD, and therefore I don't call myself a historian. I am a I'm a student of history. I'm a student of the American Revolution. I learned these things this week, and I come share them with you. I just am inviting you to come learn along with me, and I'm really grateful that you guys are. I mean, it's fascinating that I can't tell you how much I appreciate the 8 of you that are watching right now. I sincerely, with all my heart, can't tell you how much I appreciate you guys coming. In fact, before we go, it is the 1-year anniversary of Founder of the Day. Now, I was thinking about opening up the new stuff I got going on here with a party hat on and one of those like party. You know what I'm talking about. Those like blowers that you have it. Someone's gonna freeze frame that. That's not gonna work out very well. But it was, so I didn't have one around the house. I thought I would. So instead, before we go, I am gonna play us out with the beginning of Yankee Doodle Dandy. Now, I cannot play the recorder, I found out this week. I play a variety of musical instruments, none of which are the recorder. So I'm going to play this. I'm gonna be embarrassed. Oh, more questions coming in. Yeah, I really love what you do. Oh, thanks, Zebras. That's really nice. That is one of the reasons I started Founder of the Day. Is because I just love talking about the American Revolution. I love reading about it. And I literally was on the phone with my dad, who asked me the same question, why are you not a teacher? And I'm like, well, I live in New York. And I super appreciate teachers all over the country, even in New York. But it's not for me, personally. Yeah, I really love what you do. Thank you, Matthew. I am super happy. Thanks, guys. Yeah, no, I'm grateful you guys are here, and for your super polite comments. Again, I'm always ready for questions, even if it's not here. I was actually thinking about doing kind of an Ask Me Anything, maybe over the weekend or a weekend. Now that I have this cool live setup. I should say, I'm still going to shoot most of my regular weekday videos on my phone until I can get a better editing setup. This live stuff is whatever. I got it up. I can just do it. But I have to get it a little bit of an editor, and I think I can improve my weekday videos a lot. My usual videos a lot. And also, I'm going to do my interviews are going to be improved tenfold. Now, tomorrow there is an interview with a special guest to celebrate Constitution Day, foreshadowing. But give me another week or two, and I'm going to, instead of relying on Zoom to focus the camera on whoever's talking, I'll be able to, like I'm doing right now, click around and be like, here, this is not going to look great, but this is what I can do very easily. Now, one of these will be a person, and one of these will be me. But let's get back. Yeah, it won't just say Skype and not available. It'll be me and another person. I can blow them up. There's a lot I can do. It's going to be great. But I don't want to keep you guys all night. It's been an hour, and I was trying to keep it under a half an hour this week. I'm trying to be nice and keep it under a half an hour, but you guys have been commenting, which is exactly what I want. I want this to be a conversation more than anything. So thank you so much. Someone coming in. I thought about becoming a history teacher, went with insurance, should have went with teaching. Well, now you get to stay home and do it, right? Depending on where you live. Well, either way, to be fair, I don't think the money's in teaching. Okay, great. I see people leaving out. So I am going to play us. This is me embarrassing myself for you to celebrate 1 year. It's just half a refrain. It's You guys are still here. Oh man, I thought you all left because I want to nail it. Nailed it. Cut and print. Send it to the big leagues. I'm going to be a millionaire. Thanks, guys. I just want to do something silly to celebrate. I was really surprised when I looked it up. I was like, oh, wait. I started it last September, didn't I? And I looked it up. I'm like, oh, man, it's Wednesday. It just coincides with the live video. That's great. It's perfect. So, crickets. Hey, be nice to me, man. I just talked for half an hour. If I had more lung capacity, I would have nailed that. Oh, mark my words. I would have nailed that. All right, guys, I'm gonna get out of here. Thank you again so much. I will be back, like I said, special video tomorrow, right? Regular video on Friday. Yeah, let me know. Leave me a comment if you would be interested in me finding a time to do like a talk about more general things, ask more questions. I was actually considering doing it with. I have a bunch of like old cards I haven't used in a decade that are about the American Revolution, and if none of you want to play, give it back to my son. I actually bought this for my wife to play with me because I play other instruments, decently. And I bought this like a decade ago to share with my then girlfriend and be like, yeah, jam out with me. And it didn't. Now it's just my kids. Great. Thanks, guys. Oh, like I said, I might do something live. I'll like have flashcards and we could play like, put in our guesses or something like that. I'll think of more stuff. I don't want to keep you forever. I do want to say thank you and round bottom. And let's see, can I end it?